Saddam Hussein was an American-backed tyrant who would have never risen to power without the backing of the West. Saddam persecuted anyone the US didn't like, such as the Iraqi communists, Shias, Kurdish nationalists, and even members of his own party who were supportive of Hafiz al-Assad. In 1980, Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion of Iran. The United States, France, and Britain supported Saddam's invasion of Iran, with the aim of fighting Iranian influence in the region. These nations also supported Saddam's use of chemical weapons against Iranians. Western powers even continued to support the Saddam regime after the 1988 chemical weapon attack on the Kurdish town of Halabja, which killed at least 5,000 civilians. Saddam conducted a genocide of the Kurdish population of Iraq, which involved mass executions, disappearances, and the murder of up to 180,000 Kurds between the year 1987 and 1989. Thanks to the support of Western powers, over 1 million people were killed in the Iran-Iraq war, and both countries were left deeply scarred. US and British support for Saddam Hussein's regime only began to fade when Iraq invaded the oil-rich Western ally of Kuwait in 1990. But even after this war, Western governments still seemed reluctant about wanting Saddam Hussein to go. When popular rebellions spread throughout Iraq in the aftermath of the conflict, they stood by and watched as the Saddam regime brutally suppressed dissenters. In 1991, a huge rebellion broke out against the Saddam Hussein regime. This revolt spread across the whole country. Sunni and Shia Arabs and Kurds all rebelled against the Ba'ath regime. The Shia population of Iraq had for long been oppressed by Saddam Hussein, who executed and assassinated many Shia Islamic scholars. For example, scholars such as Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, Hassan al-Shirazi, Muhammad Taqi al-Khoy were killed by the Saddam regime. In 1980, the famous Shia Islamic scholar Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr was executed by the Saddam regime along with his sister Amina Sadr. An iron nail was hammered into al-Sadr's head and he was set on fire. These executions raised no criticism from Western countries, as these killings were in fact supported by Western countries. In 1982, Saddam Hussein also ordered the deaths of 148 Shia men and boys in the village of Dujail after an assassination attempt. Writers, poets, and intellectuals also took part in the revolution and played a big role in the build-up to the rebellion. Throughout the Saddam regime, Iraqi intellectuals such as Abdul Wahab al-Bayati, Baland al-Haydari, Saadi Yusuf, Musa al-Naqdi, Ali al-Shawq, Ali Jawad al-Tahir, Yusuf al-Sayyigh, Fawzi Karim, and Aziz al-Sayyid Jassim were imprisoned by the Saddam regime. In 1978, the Iraqi writer known as Sattar Jabr Nasser was arrested and tortured by the Saddam regime. Nasser was released after 3 months. Soon after his release, he was arrested for the second and final time, after which he disappeared. In 1980, Fuad al-Tikerli published a novel which was one of the few to openly criticize the Iraqi government without repercussions. However, others were not so lucky. For example, the Minister of Information, Abdullah al-Kamali, who was a poet and the writer of the Iraqi national anthem, was executed because he was quoted referring to Saddam's illiteracy in a private meeting. In 1990, Iraqi poet Hassan Mutlaq was executed by hanging for speaking out against Saddam. The 1991 Iraqi uprising began in the south, when a large number of Iraqi soldiers who defected from the army joined forces with Islamic parties and rebelled against Saddam Hussein. Shia Islamic scholars in southern Iraq played a huge role in encouraging people to rebel. For example, the Islamic scholar known as Al-Sabzawari issued a fatwa in support of the uprising. Muhammad al-Sadr also openly defied Saddam. He organized many poor people in Baghdad and led a rebellion against Saddam and the Ba'ath Party. Another scholar known as Muhammad Baqir al-Hakim, whose 5 brothers were previously executed by Saddam, also called on all Shias to rise up against the Saddam regime. Although many in the West tried to portray the Shia uprisings in southern Iraq as purely inspired by the Islamic Revolution in Iran, this was not the case, as many Iraqi scholars in Najaf disagreed with Khomeini's political philosophy and his authoritarian rule. This was also the case in Iran, where scholars such as Hussein Ali Muntaziri, Muhammad al-Shirazi, and Muhammad Kazim Shariat Madari were arrested and placed under house arrest by the Khomeini regime for criticizing Khomeini. Saddam Hussein also accused Iraqi Shias of being backed by Khomeini in order to portray the rebellion as an outside influence. However, this was clearly not the case, as this rebellion was a grassroots uprising which was as a result of tyranny, religious suppression, and economic problems in Iraq. After the rebellion, there was a large-scale crackdown on Islamic scholars in Iraq. Even the most senior scholars were targeted by the regime. For example, despite being over 90 years old at the time of the uprisings, Abdul Qasim al-Khoy was placed under house arrest, and the same year, dozens of members of prominent religious families were disappeared. Saddam did not just target Shia Islamic scholars, but also Sunni scholars, and Islamic political parties. For example, the Iraqi Islamic Party was banned under the Saddam regime. Many Sunni scholars had also declared Saddam as a traitor and a tyrant. For example, the Egyptian Sheikh Abdul Hamid Kishk called Saddam a hypocrite and an American agent. In 1991, shortly after the eruption of popular uprisings in southern Iraq, the Kurdish people of the north also began a rebellion. Although there was disunity between Kurdish groups such as the Barzanji and Talabani tribes, many Kurdish leaders such as Sheikh Uthman ibn Abdul Aziz called on all Kurds to unite and put aside their differences. Eventually, Saddam Hussein brutally crushed the rebellion and tens and thousands of civilians were killed. But the United States military, which defeated Saddam in Kuwait, was nowhere to be seen. This is because the United States did not want Iraq's future to be decided by the people of Iraq. Instead, the US invaded Iraq in 2003 and installed a puppet government. Until then, they made sure Saddam remained in power and helped him in crushing rebellions. Instead of supporting the popular rebellion against Saddam, the United States imposed sanctions on Iraq, which affected citizens much more than the Ba'ath government. There was a huge lack of food and medicine, which, according to the UN, killed 1.2 million people. Saddam Hussein's severely weakened status after this huge rebellion in 1991 led him to publicly embrace Islam and portray himself as some sort of Islamic revolutionary in order to gain wider support. All of this was despite his years of brutality against both Shia and Sunni Islamic scholars. From the very start, the Western media has grossly misinterpreted these rebellions. The uprising in the south was portrayed exclusively as a Shia Muslim revolt backed by Iran, and the insurrection in the north was reported as an exclusively Kurdish nationalist uprising. However, the truth is that the uprisings in both the north and the south of Iraq were multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and working-class insurrections and were led by the common people of Iraq.